Everyone, welcome to our conversation today on sparking and scaling Canada's innovations in partnership with Rideau Hall Foundation. We're reflecting on how we can collectively better support community innovators, especially when there are so many worthwhile initiatives coming to life during times of uncertainty and crisis. My name is Vinod Rajasekaran. I am publisher and CEO of Future of Good, a fast-growing digital publication covering Canada's social impact world. Every week, we equip thousands of impact-oriented professionals, entrepreneurs, and leaders like you with stories, insights, and analysis to help you stay current and work smarter in a new era of impact. And we're celebrating our second birthday next week. So our community has grown to over 1,500 members across the country since membership went live last year. So if you're not yet a member, for our second birthday, we have a very special invitation for you. So don't miss out. The info is in the chat. So when you have a second, have a look at that. I'm super excited about the conversation today. And here's the backdrop. The pandemic has had damaging effects on communities, and there are many cascading effects which are yet to be seen. But COVID has also sparked a number of grassroots projects across the country, projects of all kinds, of all scales, that are supporting families, entrepreneurs, women, elderly, youth, and many more. With Future of Good's coverage of how the pandemic is reshaping our sector and society, we've heard about so many of these compelling projects since we began our coverage last year. Thousands of innovators have taken action and brought to life solutions to community and societal problems that will have a lasting impact far beyond the pandemic. And among the thousands, we're excited to host 4 innovators as speakers here today. They come from different walks of life, from different backgrounds and communities. They work in all kinds of different fields, but their work in the last 10 months in particular has been game-changing. And we're super happy that we've found allies in Rideau Hall Foundation in advancing this work and this conversation. Among a number of initiatives in innovation, Rideau Hall Foundation established the Canadian Innovation Week to recognize Canadian achievements and inspire the next generation of innovators. Amy Mifflin-Sills, Director of Innovation and Skills at Rideau Hall Foundation, is here with us. We'll have a short conversation with Amy as part of our wrap-up. So with that, very special welcome to everyone. I'll now turn it over to Future of Good editor, Kylie Adair. Kylie, over to you.
Thanks, Vinod, and hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kylie Adair. I'm our content editor at Future of Good, and I am so excited to host this conversation today. So I'll just, again, set a little bit of context. So, as Vinod mentioned, for the past 10 and a half months, since March of 2020, we've been covering the innovations the social impact world has produced under really immense and, to use a cliche term at this point, unprecedented pressure. Some of the innovations may not have looked like innovation in the most traditional sense. They've been pivots and adaptations that organizations have made to survive and to continue serving the communities who need them. Others have been more kind of shiny and new. They've been people who have stepped up in new ways to meet emerging needs. All of these innovations are valuable, and I think we can learn so much from all of them. But what we really want to explore through this conversation is how the social impact ecosystem can better support these innovators, no matter what kind of innovation they're doing, both through the current crisis and so that we can be ready for the next one. So we have 4 speakers here today to dive into all of this and more with us. And I'll just introduce them to you briefly here before we get into the conversation. So Victoria Grant joins us, and Victoria leads the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, an Indigenous-led fund created during the pandemic to respond to urgent community needs while taking a long-term view on building community resilience. Alvar Pillai is the CEO of Fable Tech Labs, an accessibility testing platform that connects digital teams to people with disabilities for user testing and feedback. Doug Pawson is the Executive Director of End Homelessness St. John's, an organization working to make St. John's the next Canadian community to do just that, to end homelessness. And Allison Gibson is a program manager with Spring, a global incubator, accelerator, and advisory firm that supports impact entrepreneurs, investors, and ecosystem builders. So our first section of this conversation, our first round, is really focused on imagination. So before we jump into reflecting on the past year and what it has meant and sort of what we've learned, let's take a moment to really look ahead and to imagine where we want to be. in the future. So our question for this first round for our 4 speakers is, what is one way that you would like to radically or reimagine how the world of social impact sparks and scales innovative solutions in times of crisis? So you'll each have around 1 or 2 minutes to share a bold idea. Please be as specific as possible and give us a description of what it could look and feel like. And please feel free to talk about this in the context of the work that you do. So please feel free to give us any information about your work as well. As it relates. So maybe Victoria, we'll start with you as someone who is both supports innovators and it is an innovator yourself, having started up the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund in a time of crisis. What's your big idea?
Okay, I'm just gonna, I'm Victoria Grant and I'm Timiagma Anishinaabe, which means deep water woman or people, woman of the deep water people. I'm Loon Clan, and all of that means something, and the work you do. I guess my radically imagine, I can't imagine anything radical. I actually don't think of myself as an innovator. I think of myself, and I, you know, we often talk in the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund how language is important, and so when I think, I don't think of myself as a leader. I think of myself more as a facilitator, bringing in, working with people who have some of the same goals. And I think going forward, I think that's, you know, my big bold idea would be that Indigenous people in this country are on the same footing as the rest of Canada, and that we are, that there will be this kind of support for Indigenous people in Canada going forward. That's what I see is, you know, the Indian Act is gone. And we're living to the treaties as opposed to living to the Indian Act, which takes the powers out of the treaties. That's my big, bold idea.
Thank you, Victoria. And as someone who thinks a lot about language, that was a really interesting way to start off the conversation, I think. So thank you for that. Alvar, maybe we'll go next to you.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Alvar. Just a quick background, a little bit about me. I moved to Canada pretty recent. I moved here about 5 years ago. I moved here to do my master's in inclusive design. I have a huge passion for design and making sure that anything that we produce is available to everyone. And so got into digital accessibility, and with Fable, what we do is we help make sure that anything that's available online is available to people with disabilities. In terms of, you know, radically scaling and coming up with innovative solutions, especially in the time of crisis. And I think we've seen this with COVID, how vulnerable some groups are in our society. And so the way I think we can scale solutions is by actually focusing on the outliers. As governments, as businesses, how we make decisions often is trying to find something that can be applied to most people. So we're always kind of designing for 80% of the population and ignoring the edge cases in our society. And the edge cases in our society are the most vulnerable. So I think the way we actually create amazing innovative solutions is by focusing on those very groups. Throughout COVID, like our approach should have been like, how do we make sure, you know, seniors are taken care of? How do we make sure people with disabilities are taken care of? How do we make sure Indigenous people are taken care of? If our approach is prioritizing our most vulnerable, I think we would automatically take care of the 80%. So I think that's kind of what we need to start making as a standard of let's focus on the people that have the least access and need the most support. And that way we'll always create adaptable solutions for everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's so interesting. It's brings us back to language, and that marginalization is not just a word; it's a real experience. So maybe Doug, we'll go to you next. What's your big idea for radically reimagining the way we support innovators through a crisis?
Well, thanks to the Future Good team for inviting me to the conversation. It's hard to think about these big imaginations of radically reimagining our system, but how do we reimagine a more just and fair world? And from our perspective, and in Homelessness St. John's, working in the housing and homeless serving sector, I think it's important for us to recognize and acknowledge just homelessness itself is not a problem. It's really the culmination of system failures that lead people to live in poverty. The erosion of labor standards, the rise of precarious employment, lack of mental health and addiction, substance abuse supports, inadequate investments in education, trauma as a result of longstanding colonial practices, gender-based violence. Like, there's a number of factors that lead people to experience homelessness, and they really are the result of system failures. But I guess if I'm thinking about here, how do we reimagine the social impact like we'd like to create, like I'd like to see in St. John's and around the country? I mean, just I guess indulge me for a moment. Something that I've been thinking about is how do we imagine? And if we were just all to take a moment just to imagine for a second, painting a picture here. We're all in a setting. It's probably a little bit warmer than it is right now today, but we're all sitting together in this post-pandemic world. We're not sure why we've been asked together to get together. We're just waiting for somebody to come up to this podium. We're not sure what it is, but all of a sudden, we see like an elected official, maybe two, maybe more. And when the ceremony gets going, all of a sudden we're hearing from these officials that the reason we're gathered is because we're celebrating the end of homelessness in our community. We're closing our shelters, right? So this celebration can be a real tangential thing to work towards for me, I think. And it's not just that we've ended homelessness and everybody has a home. It's because we've recognized that our systems are all intertwined. We're not going to end homelessness just because everyone has housing, but because we've invested in people and communities and the necessities to ensure everyone has equitable access to services and the supports they need to live their best lives. So I think for me, reimagining how people interact with the systems and how we make those systems fair and more equitable is going to be the solution to these big radical issues that we continue to face in our community and around the country.
Mm-hmm. I love that idea of having that end goal so tangibly present as you're doing your work. Thank you, Doug. And we'll go to Victoria next. In the sort of lens of your work with Spring, supporting innovators, what's your big idea for radically reimagining this work?
Oop, I think you mean me, Allison, not Victoria.
Oh, Allison, I'm so sorry. I did mean Allison.
No, it's okay. I'd love to work with Victoria though. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you to Future of Good for having me, and definitely +1 to what everyone has said, especially Alwar. I really resonate with the idea of when kind of coming up with radical ideas for the future, we need to look out and include those who are often not included. So one thing that I've found to be very successful for myself and the others in my community is when we're having these important discussions to make sure that the beneficiaries or the ones that we're trying to actually help or create solutions for are included in the discussion. Often when we have these conversations about outliers or marginalized communities, those people aren't represented at the table. Their voices aren't heard. And in fact, sometimes they're coming up with solutions or what we think are solutions that might not be helpful or what those communities actually need. So for me, being able to kind of radicalize or like turn something around involves just providing a seat at the table for those that we often overlook. They often have really, really cool ideas that sometimes we don't even think about because we're not living their lives or walking a day in their shoes. So that's something I'm really passionate about. And in fact, I don't make any decisions about community or those I'm trying to help without consulting them first. And without, of course, making sure that what I'm doing it makes sense or is something that they want. Another thing quickly to add to that is I think when we're having these discussions, having representation from kind of everybody also makes sense. So if you're involving, all levels of government or you're looking to social purpose agencies for support and funding, we really need to kind of look at how we're having these conversations together. And now that most of us or a lot of us do work from home, I find that corporate culture of like excluding people or like the managers are having the meetings and like people who are below that have their meetings, it's kind of gone. Like I've noticed we're all just creating more space for everyone to be heard. So I'd really love to see that continue more and just kind of get rid of like dismantle all these barriers we've created and just say, inviting anyone to the table that has valuable feedback, welcome them and see what, really cool results we can come up with.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really crucial piece of the puzzle, I think. I wanted to open it up as well, now just to all of our speakers. Do we have any sort of responses to each other's big ideas? Anything you wanted to build on or challenge, perhaps?
I think listening to everybody, I think one of the things is there was some similarity amongst all of our conversations. And I think totally together, we need all of that to make this, to make that change, to make those changes, to make that kind of social impact.
Mm-hmm. Right, it's no one,
no one
all and all solution.
And one of the big things I think, and I was thinking about this yesterday, is what really you need to be to, or what you really need to have is the idea of trying something, taking the risk. You need to be a risk taker. You need to be not afraid. You can be unsure, but you need to be brave, I guess, as opposed to not afraid to take your ideas and take them out there.
Absolutely, yeah. To use the again the cliche term, it's unprecedented. You're dealing with emerging, unprecedented needs, so you're going to have to be brave and try something new. Absolutely. So we'll move on to our next round now, which is sort of more about forecasting, looking at sort of trends, signals, and envisioning our preferred future. So, you know, something I've learned through doing this work and through covering the social impact world is that social impact work often follows a set of well-worn processes and paths. And, you know, many of these exist for good reason. Many of them do work. Some of them don't, arguably. But either way, a lot of these processes take quite a lot of time, and time that we sometimes don't have in a crisis. So in this portion of the conversation, let's really explore what works and what doesn't work in terms of the ecosystem supports available to crisis innovators right now. And let's also talk about this through the lens of foresight. So getting to the bottom of whether the supports available today are enough for tomorrow's crisis. So for this portion, we'd really like it to be sort of a back and forth between our speakers. So please feel free to come off mute, respond to one another, challenge one another. We'd like this to be more of an open dialogue than our first round. And we also invite those of you joining us from home. I can see this is already happening in the chat, but please feel free to add your thoughts and your questions into the chat, and we will do our best to get to them if we do have some time. So maybe I'll just throw out a sort of launch point to start with, and then we can get the conversation flowing. So what is sort of the current support available to people who are innovating and coming up with solutions for crisis times and for emerging needs? What is the support available to them right now? And is it enough? Is it sufficient? Maybe Victoria, we'll start with you. Yeah.
This is another one where I thought is what allowed me to begin down this journey. And what happened is there was relationships that have been built. All these things have been long-term, in the sense that to get the $1.4 million that we started with, there were 4 organizations that we had that I and my colleague had long-standing relationships with. We had been working together almost since 2008. The Declaration of Action was another, by the philanthropic community, was another tool that put that all in. And also, to quote Mary Simon when we talked about doing this, it is like one of the things Indigenous communities are good at is responding in crisis, because we've lived in crisis. So it almost is a learned behavior. And in some ways, that's why I think that's why the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund is where it is. It's because we have lived in crisis. It's because of that learned way of living, and the fact that we have some risk takers out there, and the resiliency of the community is so much there.
I think that's a really interesting point that you bring up, Victoria, because I remember when COVID happened, and then there was information being distributed about just like the stats around COVID and, you know, all the news channels, the way they were reporting it, we noticed that a lot of the information was in inaccessible formats. And so that wasn't available to people with disabilities. Like even the whole concept of like, you know, flattening the curve for someone who's blind, that was not explained. Like, what does flattening the curve mean? Like, what are we trying to do? What does this graph represent? But what it actually highlighted was the fact that how removed are these communities from our day-to-day. The crisis highlighted that. So for us, it brought attention, but for the community, and when we chat with the community, it's like, yeah, we don't have access to this on a regular basis. And one of the things that I feel like I'm noticing now is I think the concept of, you know, when we talk about social enterprise and being in the private sector, and when you have a company that's, you know, socially motivated, has a purpose, it often gets like frowned upon from the VC community because people just want, like, you know, for profit, like have the high potential to scale. And I actually raised our seed round during the crisis. Like I started in March, right when it hit. And what I noticed was a shift. I think people and communities and VC communities actually realize the systems that we have and how broken they are and how excluded a lot of communities are. And I actually saw a bunch of VCs and the VCs who joined Fable's round of taking that responsibility of like, yeah, we need to start doing more than just profit. We need to have this purpose-driven responsibility and invest in that. So there is change that's happening, and companies want to, and VCs want to support that more, which I think is a great change to see happen.
Yeah, I'll jump in here too. I mean, those are great examples in our sector. We really are a system planning entity in the sense that, you know, we're not necessarily, you know, delivering specific programs or services, but we did immediately launch into a program trying to connect individuals working with organizations to private landlords, because we knew that, you know, at the very beginning of the pandemic, it was just the emphasis on getting home and staying home. We just felt like we had to jump in, and we had a sort of a minimal viable product to work with, and we're able to get that running. But you know, I think for me, I think in terms of I guess the first question that Kylie was posing around the supports, and where we went with some of our funding was to through the federal government's Reaching Home initiative. We actually looked at how do we create a system-wide response? Like, how do we get some of these big public institutions that haven't been playing really well with the community or with ourselves and with each other to work really closely together? And so we kind of, you know, we had a little bit of leverage with a little bit of money. So we made sure that we use that to support them and invest with them in these system responses, with the idea that, you know, over time we would have better supports in the long run for folks. So just an example would be, you know, we weren't able to help people isolate who were out of the shelter system, who were in active addiction or mental health issues. And so we worked with our health authority to develop a harm reduction program, and now that's integrated into the system. That wouldn't have happened without COVID, and that wouldn't have happened without sort of a big push by our team and our community. So I think, you know, leveraging our power within the community to fight for those big changes that were necessary anyways are really important for us. But in terms of supports, oh my goodness, I don't know where innovators or people who are trying to deal with these moments of crises that are responsible for such big portfolios of responsibility go. But our team just rose to the occasion, like so many folks in the community. And it's really a testament to our commitment to doing what's right, that we're able to get to where we were then, and to push where we are today.
I really love that. And I wanted to just jump in quickly because I saw some comments in the chat about, you know, this is all great, but when talking to different funders, they might be risk averse, or, you know, who helps the people on the ground, the little guys, so to speak. And COVID has been wild for everybody, but as soon as COVID hit, my whole world was turned upside down because I work specifically at the time with food, catering, hospitality, and my industry is decimated. So there wasn't really an opportunity for me to quote unquote pivot within what I was doing. I had to completely reimagine every single part of my life, my business, and it was stressful. And throughout the process, people were championing me, supporting me, helping me, giving me like the high five. But when I would go home at the end of the day and I'm completely exhausted or in tears from something that I saw in the media or just wiped from, the stress of COVID life, it started to dawn on me that the support needs to be, I don't even know the word for it, but it just needs to be more robust. Like throwing money at situations wasn't enough. I was coming home from work where I thought I was doing a great job and then opening my email and seeing hundreds of people saying, I'm hungry, I'm starving. You work with food, can you get me food? And then instantly being like, okay, cool, let's just give out food. So I think a lot of the really great initiatives and things that have come out of COVID have been like with minimal planning, which has been amazing. There wasn't the back and forth. There was no red tape. There was no, let me write a report and email this person. It was like, what can we do with the resources we have now to help the people who need it the most? And let's go. So I would love, love, love to see that continue once COVID is long gone, which is soon, hopefully, because I need to go to the beach. That's another story. I would love to see us continue to just kind of get to the work. Let's do the work, and being able to collaborate and team up with anybody who's interested, regardless of their walk of life, would just be, to me, the most amazing thing.
One of the places, what we're seeing is with our funding is food and food security. People are thinking differently about food, in this world where we've been, where the world was getting smaller, or at least we believed it to be getting smaller, and you could live in community and not talk to your neighbor. Though, that's changed. That's changed with COVID in a way that I don't, that I hope we don't lose afterwards. So, I guess one of the things as I look at where we are and what we're supporting and the kind of support we've been giving out, it breaks my heart that, their food and food security is an issue. Mental health is an issue. That those are the things that accessibility to, to the internet and to that in this time is really important. And we have some things we can really learn from this process of first of all, what is community? What's your community look like? And I heard the woman from the island off Newfoundland, Miss Zetta Cobb, talked about community and the importance of community. And she talked about how we think about our networks as communities that we live in. We define community not in a way of, and she said community can, she said if we think about community as just a physical place and what you need to put into that physical place, then we really do have community, because during, it is during this time we're really finding out where our communities are.
Yeah, I think one of the things we've seen is just through COVID, it's like what Doug, you said, like approach it as MVP, and Allison, you also kind of like alluded to that. It's like, let's build with whatever we have available and make it available to people. And I think the government has done that. Like, I don't think we've ever seen the government like ship out apps and products at the pace in which they've been doing. Like it really speaks to what our true capacity is. And versus how we typically operate. I think crisis has actually pushed everyone to operate at their highest potential. And in terms of that community, I feel like I think it's a lot to do with like Canadian, culture as well. It's like you saw so many businesses in whatever format that they could support, they were supporting, whether that's, Allison, you completely like pivoting and figuring out how to support communities, to some businesses like allocating some parts of their business to support COVID. I think it's been really nice to see that in Canada, of like everyone wants to. And I don't think we've ever seen the government just openly ask for help like this. At Fable, we get emails almost every week from the government saying we need support in these areas. We need, whether that's like user testing or any kind of like specific areas where the government needs support, they're asking for it. And it's no longer like a closed circle of companies that are pre-approved, can only support, and it's like available for everyone. So I think COVID has helped us like operate at a breakneck speed, and I hope that continues, and the access that we have right now to resources and communities continue after COVID as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that point around like the speed of which the way in which governments worked across all levels and how quickly their responses were. And it makes you think about if we had shared and collective priorities that were really founded on social justice and equity. What could we do at that speed with those resources? I mean, we saw just how important the CERB was for so many Canadians, and it gave us an opportunity to reimagine how broken, like what our social safety net could be, because it's been so broken that we had to repair it so quickly and fast in order to get resources to folks. It gives us an idea of what could be possible. And I think coming out of COVID, thinking about what could be possible, leveraging, the fact that we know governments can respond quickly and fast. We just need to help shape those priorities in terms of making it a more fair and equitable solution.
One question I want to make sure that we do get to is who's left out of the support systems for crisis innovators? Like, which innovators can't access these supports? What are those barriers or challenges to accessing what's available now? Like, we've seen so much quick pivoting and quick innovation in terms of supporting these innovators, but who's left out? Who still falls through the cracks?
It's interesting that you would ask that question, because I'm sure many of the Indigenous communities would tell you they fall through the cracks in many ways, and it just, again, I'll quote Mary Simon on this, is COVID didn't cause these issues in Indigenous communities. It just exacerbated them. So we're still dealing with what the crisis we were dealing with prior to the crisis. And I think in some ways there are an awful lot of places like that. It's just, we're responding to a crisis that was a crisis.
Wow, that's such a good point. Responding to a crisis within a crisis. I do see that within the Indigenous communities that I work with and other POC communities as well. And I think the one barrier is when we're creating, opportunities for funding and ways that people can access help, even those opportunities are still barriered in that you often have to have, a registered business, you have to be a nonprofit, you need to have audited financials or have been in business for X amount of years. And that doesn't really help or serve those that are creating responses to crisis in a crisis, because it's something that's happening today. So I don't have a business established to tackle COVID 2 years ago because COVID wasn't here. I will say a lot of the funding parameters were the loosest I've ever seen them, me trying to make it, more equitable and accessible for people to take advantage of funding or support. But still, a lot of community groups did fall through the crack. And a lot of the requests I were getting were, if I work for an organization or have affiliation with an organization that was open to being a trustee, could I help kind of like broker that conversation or, work with a lot of groups? So I said yes. And then I was overwhelmed. I had way too many people to help, and I still do, because they're not able to access these forms of funding or come up with, a fancy grant or like a plan when in their day-to-day lives, they're dealing with crisis. So when they go home, they're not going to pop open their laptop and just produce this wonderfully written grant application. So I think we're still leaving out the ones who are really doing the work on the ground, because they're doing the work on the ground. So I've been trying to support them by recognizing I may not be on the front lines all the time, but perhaps I can lend my skills and expertise. But even that's not enough, because I still have my other jobs and commitments. So I think really to accelerate the change or the way that we're getting funding or help to people is really getting rid of the barriers, right? I'm not saying just give money to anybody to do whatever they'd like to do with, but if there's a community or grassroots organization that may not be a registered nonprofit, but they have a track record of producing results and creating positive impact, we should be working with them way more and supporting them.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, when you were talking about the crisis within the crisis and access, one of the things the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund has done is we've had 9 intakes of applications, over 300 applications since June. We've processed, I think, well over 100 applications, and this was all through June and December. And I can tell you that it's an incredible amount of work. And I saw a comment on here that takes too much time to review and approve. And during this time, our philosophy or our process was 3 things. It had to be related to COVID. It had to be immediate, and it had to be an urgent request. And in that field, we didn't tell people we didn't tell community what they needed. Community told us what they needed. And I'll be really interested as we move forward in reviewing and, you know, picking the data out of that and seeing really how effective has all this been, because I really, you know, the response we're getting from community is incredible. And it's that letting them, or not even letting them, we're partnering with you to do what you need to do. That's a whole different way of looking at funding.
I mean, such a good question. Who's left out? I mean, Jesus, I think from the way it's shaped out in our community in many ways is that, you know, those who are already vulnerable are just left more vulnerable. I mean, low wage earners, social assistance recipients never really got a lot of benefits out of this. And even if they were able to avail of them, it was only temporary. And a temporary reprieve was never going to be sufficient enough to find the support for them to move out of. So out of those situations. So, you know, as we see, you know, maybe how we transition through 2021, you know, how do more organizations, more folks, leaders recognize those individuals and try and find supports for them. But yeah, I just see those are the folks that continue to be left out, and it's hard for any one group or collective community to just address it. But I don't see it getting better for those groups, those vulnerable groups who came into COVID already vulnerable.
I'd like to pick up on something you said, Allison, about just the overwhelm that can come with trying to respond to really pressing emerging needs during a time of crisis. So I want to throw out this question of how can the ecosystem support innovators, but do so in a way that is sustainable and takes into account the well-being of people who are actually doing the work and doing work that is incredibly emotionally draining or physically draining in some cases. How can we do this in a way that's sustainable for those people?
I mean, I'd love to start with this one. One thing that kind of caught me off guard in a good way, I would say in like March, April, when I felt like my life was upside down, were people reaching out to offer support, genuine offers in ways that I could have never expected that. And I'm still so grateful for. And it was everything from in-kind support. Are you working on a project? Can I help you review something? Can I connect you with somebody? And those genuine offers took a load off of my plate and really helped me kind of continue to help the communities I was working with, but also just protect my personal space and my mental health. It was extremely overwhelming to have, you know, everybody going through this at the same time, but then everybody looking to me or people like me for the answers when we're also going through it. So it was difficult to separate, I want to help others from I need to help myself first. I'm absolutely no good to anybody at the end of the day when I come home completely wiped and exhausted from just a day of too much asking and taking. So I loved how people stepped up, and I really think that needs to continue once, you know, COVID is over. Those offers of support still need to help. And similarly, I saw kind of the same initiative or movement with like Black Lives Matter, and that George Floyd being murdered sparked literally this discussion around the world about like, you know, what is happening with our social justice systems and criminal justice systems, and this needs to change. And we're calling for advocacy and inclusion and all that. And all that was great. But I've noticed, of course, you know, everyone slowly but surely, okay, rewind, not everyone, a lot of people are slowly but surely going back to their regular day-to-day lives. And those that were deeply affected in my community by the things we saw, you know, happening, like with George Floyd and other people, we're still affected. We're still going through it. The nightmare, so to speak, doesn't end for us. And we're still expected to get up, go to work, perform, overperform, be your best friend, be your advisor, tell you how to do this. We can't. So I really think people need to be genuine with their offers of support, but also do some of the work. Educate yourself. There's tons and tons of resources. If you don't know where to look, ask someone. They'll point you into the direction. But continuing with kind of this whole like love thy neighbor and let's come together really needs to continue, and it can't fall off. Otherwise, the ones that we're counting on to get the work done, including myself, we're just going to be burnt out and then absolutely of no use to anybody.
That was thanks for sharing that. I think it's everyone's going through so much and trying to do so many things, and going through something personally is never an easy challenge. And I think we're definitely seeing it even in my team and my family of just how our mental health has been hit throughout this pandemic. For me, the way I've been thinking about this question is a little different. I'm thinking of, you know, everyone who's stepped up and pivoted their business or pivoted their priorities to help with the crisis. What happens to them who've all allocated all of their resources and time to help with this crisis? What happens to them when this is no longer a crisis? So, you know, where you have just like even like companies that are producing like masks and PPEs and just like completely changing their business priority for the need of society. What happens to them after this is the demand is not there, while, you know, things are coming back to so-called normal? What happens to them? Because I think it's important to address that, because everyone showed up for this crisis because they wanted to fix it. But if we don't think of how do we support these individuals and support these organizations after, I worry that people might not show up the next time we have a crisis.
Yeah, that's a really kind of sobering idea to think about, is what happens next if we're all burnt out from this crisis. And it sort of speaks to one of the questions we actually had written down, which is what are the implications, the sort of like cascading implications, if the ecosystem doesn't step up and better support these innovators? What will it look like next time around?
It's incredibly fascinating for me in the sense of, you know, we're looking at the crisis, and we are living in this time, and as we look for support, and, you know, sometimes it's invisible to us in the sense that we're so focused on where we are and what we're doing, and then when we think about the big, you take a big picture worldview, we're never, I don't see us ever going back to what we were before this. You know, I don't see us, I certainly don't see myself in a theater packed full of people, or I don't see a Downsview SARS concert. Those are the things I just don't. So things are going to change. Entertainment's going to change. All of these things are going to change. We just have no idea how. So I think if we look and say, okay, how, with the assumption of when there isn't a crisis, we don't know the long-term effects of this. So when will normal be normal? That's a huge question in and of itself. And I don't, is that 2 years out? Is it 5 years out? Is it 10 years out? When we start thinking something is normal again.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in here too. I think just building off the last point around the resources for sort of social innovators and what that ecosystem looks like. I think in many cases it's reframed how we think of leadership as well. I mean, I think it was Howard, you were saying, it's brought governments asking for help and asking for new ways of doing business, and I think it's reframed how, as a sector, as an ecosystem, however you want to frame it, is I think it really has we have to reimagine what leadership looks like. And I think, if we don't, the cascading impacts are, we can see how, in the mainstream that the politicizing a pandemic doesn't really work. And I think bringing humility into that space of leadership, being able to ask questions, being able to say, I don't know, but I want to know, and I want to learn, and I need to do better. And I think that's a really important quality that I hope persists as we move forward, because it's not enough to just be strong-willed or, fight a good fight. I think we need to be more humble with the way in which we approach our work. And I mean, you see it in certain segments, and I think there's a real opportunity in our sector as an ecosystem to think that way.
What are some ways that the structural supports for innovators can enable that kind of leadership and that kind of approaching a problem with I don't know, I need to ask questions, I need to test things, I need to experiment? How can the ecosystem better support that kind of leadership? Anyone who would like to jump in?
I mean, I'll just say, I've often lamented the fact that there's not a lot of sort of leadership opportunities for folks in the nonprofit sector in this space. Generally speaking, there's not a lot of informal leadership opportunities. You really have to go through these big, institutional type settings to get qualifications that don't necessarily equip you to do what you want to do. So I think there does need to be a reframing again of how do we find those supports for folks, and it can't just be institutional. It needs to be, how do we build space for these kinds of conversations, these kind of network opportunities, because they're really valuable, and they will span far greater and have greater impact in the long run than just going through institutional settings for that.
And institutions have to change. I mean, that's where some of the problems are, is within the institutions.
Yeah, I think to add to Doug's point of things not being available in the nonprofit sector, I feel like in the industry that we're in at Fable, it's the mentality of two pocket, where you do things for profit, and then a portion of your profit will go to do something good. I think that needs to change. I think we just have to be more a one pocket mentality on the private side, where I think companies need to be more purpose driven and not approach doing things related to social good as something feel good, or the way it's perceived right now, and putting most of the onus and that responsibility in the nonprofit community.
Ooh, I love that. I'm in the middle of trying to write a blog post that I can't ever finish. And it kind of speaks to, with my experience in social enterprise, or just trying to affect positive change in community, I've noticed that the outcome is always tied to some like income or revenue generating opportunity, which is just so detrimental to the overall goal of social impact. To be, I guess, more specific, what I'm referring to is I ran a for-profit social enterprise, and everyone's like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. That's really cool. And at the end of my journey with that company, I was kind of like, I don't know if it's possible to have a for-profit social enterprise. Being that all of our goals were to support community, provide employment, provide assistance to marginalized individuals, and you need money to do that. So being a for-profit business and not able to access any sorts of grants or funding, it was very difficult, right? Because then it places all the onus on your customer. Is your customer going to pay, 3 times the price for their coffee, knowing that that cost of that coffee is impacting or affecting something socially good? No, that's my experience in almost 8 years. So I really think that tying social good to capitalism is just super detrimental, in that if we want to give money to organizations or help people, let's help them. And regardless if they're for-profit or nonprofit, right? And I'm not suggesting we give for-profit companies all these like money or tax break, I'm not saying that at all, but there are ways for-profit, or regardless of the, I guess, organizational or corporate structure of a business, there are ways for any business to do the right thing with, of course, the right leadership, guidance, and the right people at the table. But I just think the whole, here's money for a project, what did you generate, is kind of like, if the generation is not something socially impactful, then I think we kind of like are missing the point if we're requiring like funds, or like this new business idea or this new tech company has to come out of this. Like, it's not always that complicated. Sometimes we're just helping people, whether it's getting a job, putting a roof over their head, or feeding them, and that's good enough.
Yeah, I think that's totally valid, and I think it kind of stems from how is success measured. I think success often in the private sector is measured by profit and revenue, but it is changing. I think I've seen in the startup world as well of even for us when we were fundraising, and we proudly call ourselves social enterprise. I don't shy away from that word when I talk to VCs, and we had a lot of impact VCs, and I say that with quotations because they would say that they want to invest in impact-driven companies, but they were more focused on our revenue metrics than our impact metrics. And what I found problematic with structures like that is because you're always in comparison to revenue thinking of those metrics, and I feel we need to kind of separate those two and not have them interdependent. So we hold ourselves to our own metrics at Fable, where our goal is to provide more jobs, to make people with disabilities more independent, to provide opportunities to learning, professional development, personal development, and we kind of hold ourselves to that. Even if the private sector doesn't, like, the decisions we make as a company is prioritizing those. And I think if companies start taking that risk and not just limiting themselves to profit and revenue, we might see change. But Allison, I know, I agree that it's not easy, it's complex, but I feel like that's why we need to keep pushing this, because for me, it is unacceptable to say that a company that is for profit cannot be socially driven. And that's something that I'm trying to challenge and change with the way we're building Fable.
I think it just begs the question how we think of growth. Why is growth important, and what are the drivers of growth? And it works not just in the private sector or social enterprise sector, it works in the nonprofit sector. Like, growth in different ways can be a really bad thing, but we celebrate it. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to lead off with that imagery of closing shelters, closing food banks. What happens when we do these things? When we don't incentivize growth for emergency responses, when we start celebrating doing what's right, doing what's equitable, I think that's also equally applicable in the nonprofit world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this idea of working toward making the work you do irrelevant because the problem no longer exists. Absolutely, yeah. And I think this leads really well into what we wanted to talk about in the third portion of this conversation, which is what the social impact world needs to unlearn or let go of when we're thinking about crisis supports for innovators. And so I wanted to maybe throw this question to you, Victoria, because you mentioned quickly that institutions need to change the way they do things. So what is one thing that you would encourage leaders in these institutions or professionals, anyone working in the social impact world, to unlearn or let go of when it comes to supporting crisis innovators? And we'll start with Victoria, but we'll move on to anyone else.
I guess one of the things that when I think about unlearning, or when I think about systemic, let's talk about systemic racism. That's, when I think of a company or a government or any institution, they really have to look at what are the cultural barriers for the community they're in, or the communities that they serve. How can I walk into a room and be comfortable when the meeting is set up in a way that is, where I'm invited into a meeting and it's set up in a way that is what I would feel walking into, I would feel completely ill at ease. So how do you create environments that allow for, that will take those away? The assumption sometimes is, and you see it, you see learned behavior. So understanding what that learned behavior is, how do we change that behavior to be more, I guess I think about two things when I try and participate in something, is kindness and respect. Those are the two pieces that we all should enter a room in. Despite what we feel about any of the issues that were coming up, for me, if I was to work and I did this kind of work before, when doing mediation, you're looking at a business coming into a community, and they want to move there, but it's how do you understand what is good for them and good for you? But I may disagree vehemently with, for instance, cutting trees down. I may really disagree with the forest industry. But is there a way that I can come to that table and have a conversation that is respectful and kind, and think about how that changes the whole institutional way of doing things? Because sometimes you walk into a room and it's, my right is this, or this is what the intention is, and we're going there. It's not about, wait a minute, let's have a conversation about getting there. And government is the systemic racism in government. It doesn't mean that the people in that role are racist. What it means is they're working in a system that is built on racism.
Allison, what do we need to unlearn?
I'm over here snapping and clapping. I love you, Victoria. Like, you hit the nail on the head every single time. And as a woman of color, who's often the only woman of color at the table at these discussions, I feel it almost every time, right? You walk into a room, a meeting, and I'm not suggesting that every meeting I go to is filled with racists. That's not it at all. It's just that maybe the things we're discussing, or even just the ideas that things are predicated on are built off of sometimes racist or supremacist foundations, which automatically don't make me feel comfortable. So I think one thing we can unlearn, or even kind of shift our way of thinking, is how can we make a space, quote unquote, safe, that just enables people to bring their whole selves into that room, right? I don't like having to think I have to do my hair a certain way, or talk a certain way, or act a certain way to have my point being taken as valid or as legitimate, right? If I'm being invited into these spaces in these rooms, I've earned my space there. I deserve to be there. Otherwise, why would I be invited? And to me, that should be enough. So I really think again, it's like what Victoria said, not suggesting that everybody in that room is racist, but it's maybe acknowledging that the discussion, the platform, the table, whatever we're having has maybe been built upon things that were not equitable and inclusive, and challenging yourself before, you know, these meetings or discussions start, challenging yourself to see, okay, how can we make this a more equitable and inclusive process? Or what is something we haven't tried before? Or maybe let's try asking the person that doesn't maybe speak up the most or has on paper the least amount of experience, what do they think? Because I think, and we've said this many times throughout this session, is that the ideas and thoughts and discussions that can be sparked from those kind of questions are amazing and often lead to really cool projects or just outcomes that we would have never gotten to had we not considered our differences as being our assets in the first place.
Mm-hmm. That's it's hard to follow you, Allison or Victoria. Goodness, how do we unlearn? I mean, unlearn a lot of the challenges that have shaped our world, our economy, our environment. I mean, for me, I think from a sector perspective, social impact sector, it does go beyond just our sector and our interests. I think in many ways it's about recognizing the power that we have to influence and shape the future. And I think for me, I'm speaking for myself, I guess, and it first begins with, you know, recognizing, acknowledging, accepting, and committing to work tirelessly to reshape those systems that perpetuate racism, inequality, inequity, poverty. You know, and as a sector, and I think as leaders within it, you know, we're accountable to each other, but I think more importantly, we're also accountable to those who require our leadership and the supports that we're providing. We need to utilize our positions and platforms and the privilege attached to it to advocate for the change and the reframing of the power dynamics, you know, even if it means relinquishing our own power. And, you know, just to give an example of that, I mean, we put it right up front in a lot of our work. Like, we're trying to work ourselves out of a job. It's not our right. It's not, I mean, we're privileged to do the job we have, but it's not, our privilege doesn't come at the rights of others to be treated fairly and equitably. And I think it's just reframing that power. And that's really important for me to see in a sector as we move forward.
One of the things, it's interesting, you know, when I have these conversations and I'm part of these conversations, I realize that what we call the journey of life and the balance and the good and the bad and the, you know, as the Chinese say, the yin and the yang, all of this stuff, that's all part of who we are and what we are, and we'll always have that. It is that journey of striving for, always striving for, that we all, you know, we can't do without some of this stuff. And it's sad to say that, but it is, you know, it is, if we didn't have it, how would we know? That's the, you know, that's the question. So part of our real world life experience is going to have good and bad in it. It's going to have rich and poor in it. It's going to have all of these things. And we just always need to strive to make it better.
I really like that framing of, if we didn't have it, how would we even know? I think what speaks to how broken our systems are and how biased it is. And the way I think and of unlearning that we have to do, and I think this is something that's been like echoed like throughout this conversation. I think it's our approach of you know, how we make decisions, and we as society, as governments, as businesses, just always look to the average. We're so engrossed in, you know, quantifying and putting people into groups and thinking that, you know, everyone's going to fit in this one box. But often, and all the work that we're doing, you know, each of us here, we're representing different groups that are marginalized. But if we constantly keep focusing on averaging people out, even if you have to take each of our data, all of our data is here of all the people in the call, and we come up with a set of average, that's not going to represent any of us. And I think we just do that constantly as in every part of life, like whether that comes to education and the way we grade students on learning, to the way government decides what kind of funding to get, to the way businesses operate and think about customers. We just want to group people. And I think the more we do that, we're just going to keep excluding people further and further, and especially the ones who are marginalized. So my goal would be to just end average. And it's kind of been inspired by this book, The End of Average. I don't know if any of you have read it, but it kind of talks about every system and how looking at the average and how it has impacted the vulnerable, and it continues to. So that would be one thing I want us as a society to unlearn.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you for this. So we only have a couple minutes left, unfortunately. I feel like the time has flown by and we could keep talking about this for hours, but I just want to give everyone an opportunity. Maybe we'll go around and we'll just sort of share maybe, you know, one sentence, what's a sort of final takeaway you want to make sure everyone keeps in their mind as they move forward into their day and into their week and into the rest of their work. What's one thing you want to make sure everyone takes away from this conversation?
That you need to be brave and you need to take risks.
I think it's just because it's hard, or just because it's a small group of people, or it's a complex solution, doesn't mean you don't do it, or you don't give it priority.
I guess, you know, something that I, you know, said to our team and to our board is we have to be comfortable with the discomfort that system change is going to bring about.
Ooh. For me, I think it's just because, you know, something might not have been done, or maybe isn't something that's traditionally like an approach that's taken or something that's explored, it doesn't mean that you should not be doing it. I think we use the word like radical a lot, and I'm not trying to radicalize anything, but I'm a firm believer of kind of taking the path less traveled, especially with the work that I do, because I feel like the outcome is just so much more rewarding and helps way more people.
Mm. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to all of you for this really rich and fascinating conversation. Thank you, Allison and Doug and Victoria and Alvar, for your time today and for sharing your experiences and your thoughts. I've really enjoyed this conversation. And we'll move on now. I'm going to bring Amy Mifflin-Sills, who is joining us from the Rideau Hall Foundation, just to sort of do a bit of a wrap up and a reflection on what we've learned today. So Amy, if you could come off mute and join us.
Thanks, Kylie. And firstly, I just want to thank Vinod and the team at Future of Good for coming up with the idea of going ahead with this webinar and for inviting us to be a partner with you. One of the things that we work on at the Rideau Hall Foundation is helping to strengthen Canada's culture of innovation. And just by listening to all of you today, I think we can walk away and say that Canada's culture of innovation in the social innovation sector is very, very strong across the country. A couple things stood out for me. Earlier on in the discussion, Doug, Allison, and Victoria, you talked about the system-wide responses, the holistic responses that you're involved in, particularly in COVID, in a kind of a rapid response approach, bringing together partners from all across your communities to respond to people in desperate need, and how that has informed government programming. It's really interesting to hear you talk about how you are influencing government funding. And I really do hope that that continues in the future, because it's informed policy development truly at its core. And Allison, thank you so much for the reality check about how this is affecting you as leaders, responding to individuals who are in desperate need. And we often hear about the profound impact that this is having on healthcare workers across the country, but people at the community level who are working directly with individuals who are struggling, the impact during COVID, I can just imagine how difficult that must be for you. And thanks for sharing your story in that regard. And Alvar, your story about seed funding, and your seed round during COVID is I know we didn't get a lot of time to talk about it, but I'd love to hear more about that. That's very exciting, and congratulations to you. One of the things that we like to do at the Rideau Hall Foundation is to celebrate innovation. And as Vinod mentioned earlier on in the conversation, we take a time out once a year to hold Canadian Innovation Week. In 2020, we had to move it from our typical May time period to November, and we finally got it in there in between the two waves of COVID. But we're hoping to get back to celebrating Innovation Week, May 17th to 21st. And I invite all of you to share your stories using hashtag Canadian Innovation Week during that time. There'll be more information available on our website in the coming weeks. But that's a time for us to share these stories. And you never know when a spark might be lit for someone by hearing your story of what you're doing at the community level. So if there's anything I can do to help get your story out there, just feel free to reach out to me anytime. And, you know, I just think about some of the successful stories that we've been hearing about during COVID, and a couple come out, stand out for me. One of the Governor General's Innovation Award laureates, Brianne Everett, is a very successful health innovator, businesswoman out in Calgary. And so, she, you know, her day is 24/7. She's working at her business, trying to grow it and become internationally recognized. And when COVID hit, she turned to the health community and said, how can I help? And so somehow she carved out a few more hours of her day and started producing PPE, but medical grade PPE for her colleagues in Calgary. And she found funding and partners all in her spare time somehow to do that. And I know there's so many other stories of PPE production out there in Canada. It's just so great to hear communities coming together to do this. And then the last story I just want to share, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which just I hear about on a daily basis, and he doesn't stop, is Mohammed Faki from Paramount Foods in Toronto, and all the work he's doing to cook and deliver meals to starving Torontonians. And it's just so amazing that someone is such a successful entrepreneur, but at his core values is about giving back to his community. And that's the same for all of you. So thank you for everything you're doing, and thank you for sharing your stories today.
Thanks so much, Amy, for that. I think that's a really beautiful note to end on, is acknowledging the really inspiring success stories that we've heard about today, and that are happening under the radar and behind the scenes all along. So thank you, Amy, and thank you again to Rideau Hall Foundation for making this conversation possible. We really do appreciate it. Thanks everyone for joining this conversation, and I couldn't keep up with all of it, but it looks like there was a ton of conversation sparked in the chat. So thank you for contributing to that as well. And I will pass it back over to Katie for a final wrap up.
Thanks, Kylie, and thank you everyone for this thoughtful discussion, both to our speakers and, as Kylie was mentioning, everybody in the chat. There was so much great insights, book recommendations we got to get on to reading, and a few articles as well. Just a reminder, as we mentioned at the beginning of the call, if you really enjoyed this conversation and also want to stay tuned to more Future of Goods content, we do have a special promo code that you are getting in advance. Few days warning too, which is our birthday promo code for 50% off our annual membership. So Jenna, if you can put that in the chat one more time so people have that, and just invite you to stay tuned. Next week we'll also be announcing our next digital event, which we'll be hosting in celebration of next month as Black History Month, and we look forward to that conversation as well. So hope everybody has a great day, and if you have any final questions, just stay on the line, and Jenna and I will stay here and help you out. Bye everyone.